In March of 1943, inside a dim office in Berlin, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, read a report his own agents had checked and rechecked 3 separate times because nobody in his own organization could quite believe the numbers it actually contained. The report claimed that a single Ford factory in Michigan was completing an entire B-24 Liberator bomber, a machine built from more than 1 million individual parts, roughly once every 63 minutes, a production rate that struck nearly everyone who first read the figure as somewhere between wildly exaggerated and simply impossible. Canaris's own reaction, and the reaction of nearly every senior German official who eventually saw the same figures, was not alarm. It was disbelief, a refusal to accept the numbers that would end up costing German war planning considerably more than any single lost battle ever could. This is the story of how German intelligence officers spent years watching American industrial production reports arrive on their own desks and simply refusing again and again to accept what those reports were actually telling them, right up until one senior German official finally put the uncomfortable truth in writing to Adolf Hitler himself, in terms too blunt for anyone to keep misunderstanding any longer. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the intelligence that predicted it, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. German assessments of American industrial potential had been dismissive for years before Canaris ever read that specific report about Willow Run in the spring of 1943, a pattern of underestimation that stretched back well before the United States had even formally entered the war. As early as 1941, German Air Force officials had already received warnings that American aircraft production might eventually reach thousands of planes per month, projections many senior German leaders simply refused to take seriously at the time, treating the numbers as propaganda or simple exaggeration rather than genuine, actionable intelligence worth actually planning around. The dismissal rested on a specific, deeply held assumption about the fundamental character of American industry itself, that a nation known for building automobiles, refrigerators, and other consumer goods lacked the discipline, the precision, and the organizational seriousness required to produce genuinely effective modern weapons of war at any comparable scale to Germany's own carefully engineered military production. Several German officials went further still, arguing that democracy itself, with its messy, decentralized decision-making and its endless competing private interests, was simply too slow and too inefficient a political system to ever organize the kind of centralized, disciplined production effort a modern industrial war actually demanded of any nation hoping to sustain it for years rather than months. One German intelligence officer saw through that comfortable assumption almost immediately, and his own outsider perspective explains exactly why he alone among his colleagues reached such a different conclusion. Nicholas Ritter, who had actually lived in the United States before the war and had personally watched American skyscrapers rise in a matter of months, understood industrial discipline when he saw it in a way colleagues who had never left Germany simply could not. Having witnessed firsthand exactly the kind of organizational speed and confidence his own countrymen back in Berlin insisted democratic, consumer-focused America could never actually muster. Ritter's own private assessment of the American production reports reaching Berlin was blunt, and entirely without the comforting hedges his own superiors preferred to attach to any similarly unwelcome conclusion. If the data were accurate, he concluded, Germany had already lost, a private judgment reduced to nothing more complicated than time and mathematics, rather than any question of battlefield courage or tactical skill on either side of the actual fighting still underway. Before we get into how that same disbelief eventually collapsed entirely, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The specific numbers attached to Ford's own Willow Run plant, once German intelligence officers finally began taking them seriously enough to investigate further through agents operating out of Mexico City and Spain, proved genuinely difficult for anyone in Berlin to visualize accurately, let alone actually accept as a description of real, ongoing industrial output. Businessmen who had actually toured the facility described a production line stretching for roughly a mile, a building so enormous that clouds reportedly formed inside it under certain weather conditions, an industrial scale that had no real equivalent anywhere inside German-controlled territory at any point during the entire war, regardless of how much German engineers might have wished otherwise. The B-24 itself was not a simple machine to manufacture by any reasonable standard, a four-engine bomber built from well over 1 million individual parts and requiring immense coordination across thousands of individual assembly steps, precisely the kind of complex, demanding production challenge German officials had confidently assumed civilian-minded American manufacturers simply could not master at any real speed, given their own pre-war reputation for building considerably simpler consumer products. German officers checked the underlying field reports 3 separate times, specifically because the number itself, a complete heavy bomber, finished roughly every hour, seemed less like a documented industrial achievement and more like an obvious, almost insulting fantasy nobody serious could actually expect German intelligence to accept at face value without overwhelming corroborating evidence. The uncomfortable truth those reports actually described eventually reached the very top of Germany's own war economy, expressed not by an intelligence officer working quietly in the shadows, but by the man formally responsible for German weapons production itself, a figure whose own words carried an institutional weight no field agent's private report ever could. Albert Speer, appointed Reich Minister of Armaments in February of 1942, after his predecessor Fritz Todt died in a plane crash, wrote directly to Hitler in a 1944 memorandum describing the entire war as a contest between 2 systems of organization, a framing that reduced years of accumulated battlefield defeats and territorial losses to a single underlying industrial explanation few other officials had dared state so plainly to their own Führer. Germany's own system, Speer wrote with a bluntness few other officials would have risked putting in writing, given Hitler's own well-documented intolerance for pessimism among his senior staff, was outmoded, tradition-bound, and arthritic, built around exacting technical requirements and small numbers of expensive, highly advanced weapon systems produced by craftsmen trained through years of exacting apprenticeship, rather than the kind of standardized, repeatable process American industry had already perfected decades earlier. The American system, by direct contrast, drew its own methods straight from Henry Ford's earlier model of mass production, converting factories that had spent the previous decade building household appliances and automobiles into weapons plants through a combination of patriotic motivation and deliberate government policy, prioritizing overwhelming volume over the kind of individual technical perfection German industrial culture had always prized above nearly everything else in its own manufacturing tradition. That fundamental difference in philosophy produced measurable results, difficult for anyone in Berlin to keep dismissing by 1944, regardless of how comforting the earlier assumptions about American manufacturing had once felt to officials eager to avoid delivering bad news to their own Führer. Chrysler's own Detroit arsenal, designed by industrial architect Albert Kahn and built specifically for tank production, went from groundbreaking to genuinely operational capacity in a matter of months once American war mobilization actually began in earnest, construction starting in September of 1940, and the facility already substantial enough by January of 1941 to house a full-size steam locomotive brought in simply to serve as a boiler and heat the entire enormous building through the winter months. Germany, by comparison, continued investing heavily in a comparatively small number of exceptionally sophisticated, exceptionally expensive tanks, machines capable of dominating almost any single Allied vehicle they actually met in individual combat on a one-to-one basis, a strategy that made genuine tactical sense, fighting one enemy at a time, but that collapsed entirely once German forces found themselves fighting across multiple enormous fronts simultaneously against opponents who could simply replace losses faster than German industry could ever hope to inflict them, regardless of how technically superior any individual German tank actually was in a direct engagement. German industrial culture itself worked directly against the kind of rapid volume production American factories had already mastered well before the war even began, a cultural preference few German officials seriously questioned until the war's own mounting losses made the underlying costs of that preference impossible to ignore any longer. German manufacturers expected industrial workers to complete years of exacting apprenticeship before taking on skilled production roles, a craftsmanship tradition that produced genuinely superior individual machines, but that simply could not scale to match American assembly line methods built specifically around standardized parts, interchangeable components, and workers trained for narrow, repeatable tasks rather than broad technical mastery. That same national bias toward precision over volume meant German production style, in the words of one historian studying the comparison closely, never got genuinely serious about mass manufacturing until far too late in the war to actually matter. A delayed recognition that cost Germany years of production capacity it could never realistically recover once the war's own trajectory had already been set by earlier decisions made under entirely different assumptions about how long the conflict itself might actually last. This is not a story about German engineers lacking genuine technical skill, since German designers produced some of the most sophisticated individual weapons of the entire war by nearly any technical measure available to historians studying the conflict since. Machines whose engineering sophistication in several respects genuinely exceeded anything American factories actually produced across the same years. It is a story about how completely two different national philosophies toward industrial production actually determined a war's outcome long before the fighting itself reached its final, inevitable conclusion. A German system built around craftsmanship and precision that simply could not outproduce an American system built around volume and speed, regardless of how reluctant German officials proved to actually accept that uncomfortable mathematical reality when the first honest reports began arriving on their own desks years before the war's own final outcome had actually been decided on any single battlefield. A genuinely uncomfortable irony sat underneath Germany's own eventual production gap that few German officials ever seemed to have fully appreciated at the time. American automobile manufacturers had actually helped build significant portions of Germany's own pre-war military production capacity through their own European subsidiaries. General Motors' Opel division supplying the Wehrmacht with Blitz trucks from a facility specifically cited on the advice of German military planners themselves to minimize its own vulnerability to future air attack. Ford's own German subsidiary opened a truck assembly plant in Berlin in 1938, whose actual purpose, according to later American intelligence assessments, was producing troop transport vehicles for the same German army that would eventually find itself unable to match the vastly larger production coming out of those same companies' domestic American factories only a few years later. GM and Ford subsidiaries together built nearly 90% of Germany's own armored half-track vehicles and more than 70% of the Reich's medium and heavy trucks by some American intelligence estimates, vehicles serving as what one wartime report called the backbone of the German Army's own transportation system, meaning the same underlying American industrial expertise that would eventually overwhelm Germany's own production capacity had, only a few years earlier, quietly helped build part of the very German military machine that expertise would later help defeat entirely. Speer's own background made his eventual capitulation to this same uncomfortable conclusion considerably more significant than a similar admission from almost anyone else inside Hitler's own inner circle might have been. Trained originally as an architect rather than an engineer or industrialist, Speer had first come to Hitler's own attention designing grandiose ceremonial buildings for the Nazi regime rather than through any background in actual weapons production, making his own rapid transformation into an effective, results-oriented armaments administrator, all the more remarkable to observers studying his tenure after the war had already ended. British economist Nicholas Kaldor, writing shortly after the war concluded, described Speer's own administration as among the most genuinely competent political management the National Socialist regime had produced across its entire 12-year existence, a backhanded compliment that nonetheless captured just how starved German war production had been for exactly the kind of results-oriented, rationalized thinking Speer eventually brought to an office that had, under his own predecessor, achieved considerably less with considerably more resources actually available to it. Some historians studying German wartime production since have pushed back specifically against the popular post-war narrative, crediting Speer alone with any genuine armaments miracle, noting that heavy investment in German production capacity had actually begun well before Speer's own appointment in February of 1942, and that much of the dramatic production increase credited to his own tenure reflected earlier investment finally maturing into actual output rather than any single administrative genius on Speer's own part specifically. Whatever the precise division of credit between Speer's own genuine organizational reforms and investments made under his less effective predecessor, the underlying gap between German and American production capacity that Speer's own 1944 memorandum described so bluntly to Hitler never actually closed by any meaningful measure before the war itself finally ended the following year. Nicholas Ritter's own private, unwelcome conclusion from years earlier turned out to be exactly correct in the end, vindicated not through any dramatic single battlefield reversal, but through the same slow, grinding arithmetic he had already identified reading production reports most of his own colleagues had simply refused to believe when they first crossed their own desks in Berlin. Germany's own generals and intelligence officers had in the end seen America's factories clearly enough, in report after report reaching Berlin for years before the war's own conclusion. Each new document adding further weight to a conclusion nearly everyone with direct access to the raw numbers had already quietly reached long before their own political and military leadership was willing to formally acknowledge it. What they lacked for far too long was the willingness to actually believe what those reports were telling them. A failure of imagination and institutional courage considerably more costly in the end than any single lost battle or failed offensive across the entire war, since no amount of tactical brilliance on any individual battlefield could ever fully compensate for an industrial gap German leadership had spent years actively refusing to take seriously, until refusing to take it seriously any longer had simply become impossible. The war's own final outcome, decided as much in American factories as in any single European battlefield, left historians studying the conflict since with a genuinely uncomfortable lesson about the specific danger of dismissing inconvenient intelligence simply because it contradicts a comfortable, deeply held assumption about an opponent's own underlying character. German officials had access to essentially the same raw data available to anyone willing to actually read it, honestly, months and in some cases years before the war's own final outcome had been fully decided by events already well underway. The gap that actually mattered was never a gap in available information. It was a gap in the willingness to accept what that information had already been saying clearly enough for anyone actually prepared to listen. If you want more stories about the intelligence reports nobody wanted to believe until it was already too late, subscribe and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.